The port of Oswego sat at the edge of Lake Ontario in the late 1870s, and in the mornings there, the lake was wide enough that the far shore did not exist. What existed was the dock and the ropes and the smell of timber fresh cut from inland forests, laid out in long pale stacks along the waterfront. And underneath that, the older smell of the lake itself, cold and mineral and clean in a way that river water never quite was. A 16-year-old boy arriving at that dock for the first time would have felt the particular smallness of standing at an edge where the world simply continued outward and did not stop. The boy's name was Morgan Robertson. He had grown up in Oswego, which meant he had grown up near water, which meant the idea of going to sea was not a dramatic departure so much as a continuation of something already present in the air around him. In 1877, he stepped onto a working vessel for the first time as a member of its crew rather than a passenger, and the lake behind him spread gray and open as it always had, indifferent to the particular human who had just joined the long traffic moving across it. What a boy learned in those first months of working a vessel was not adventure. It was rope work and load distribution and the way weather moved differently over open water than it did over land. It was the sound rigging made against a wooden mast in different winds, a low thrum in steady conditions, something more urgent when the air was unsettled, and the way that sound became, after a while, a kind of information rather than just a sound. It was the geometry of a hull moving through water, the way a loaded ship sat differently than an empty one, the way a captain read the surface of the water ahead, the same way a careful reader reads a page, looking for what was coming before it fully arrived. Robertson worked as a merchant sailor for approximately 11 years. The years did not stay on the Great Lakes. They moved him outward, onto vessels crossing the Atlantic, and then further into the particular professional world of men who spent more of their lives at sea than on land, and who understood ocean crossings not as experiences, but as work with a particular set of technical demands and a particular set of ways in which things could go wrong. By the time he rose to the rank of first mate on Atlantic crossing vessels, he had developed the kind of knowledge that does not come from reading. It comes from standing watch in the middle of an ocean at 3 a.m. and being responsible for what happens next. First mate was not the highest rank, but it was close. It meant Robertson understood the bridge. It meant he had spent time at the wheel and away from it, reading instruments and reading weather and reading the behavior of a hull under different loads and different sea conditions. It meant that when he eventually left the sea and sat down at a desk, he was not writing from imagination alone. He was writing from memory, from training, from a decade of accumulated technical understanding that had no place else to go once the ships were behind him. The eyesight failed gradually, the way most things in a body fail, not all at once, but in increments, each one small enough to accommodate until the accumulation could not be ignored. For a sailor, eyesight was not optional. The sea required the ability to read distant water, to assess weather on a horizon, to navigate by stars on a clear night. When Robertson's eyes could no longer meet those requirements, his sailing career ended, and he returned to New York and did what a man with technical knowledge and no other obvious trade sometimes does. He began to write. New York in the late 1880s and 1890s had a considerable market for popular fiction, particularly for stories about ships and the sea, which occupied a complicated place in the public imagination. The ocean was still, at that point in history, the primary means by which the world communicated with itself at scale. People crossed it to emigrate, to conduct business, to travel. The ships that carried them were growing larger every decade, the engineering behind them becoming more ambitious, the competition between shipping lines producing vessels that were by any previous standard extraordinary. A writer who understood how those ships actually worked, not the romance of them, but the mechanics, the weight distribution, the propulsion systems, the particular vulnerabilities of a large hull moving through cold water, had material that most writers could not access, because most writers had never stood a night watch in the North Atlantic. Robertson wrote dozens of short stories for popular magazines, and he wrote longer works, and most of what he wrote was competent maritime fiction of the kind that found a reliable readership among people who were interested in the sea without necessarily having worked on it. He understood his subject the way a craftsman understands a material, from the inside, from long contact, from having been wrong about it often enough to know where it pushed back. In 1897, sometime in the months before the book was finished, Robertson sat at a desk in a small rented room in New York and worked on a novella about an ocean liner. His eyesight was weakened enough by then that the sea was entirely behind him, but the knowledge the sea had put into him was not. He was writing about a ship, and the ship he wrote about was built from everything he knew about how large Atlantic liners were actually constructed and operated, their dimensions, their power plants, their capacities, their design philosophies, their commercial pressures. The ship he invented was called the Titan. He gave it specific measurements. It displaced approximately 45,000 tons. It measured 800 feet from end to end. It ran on 3 propellers and could reach a top speed of around 25 knots. It carried approximately 3,000 passengers and crew, and it carried 24 lifeboats. Robertson described it as the largest craft afloat, and he described it through the mouths of its fictional builders and the fictional press that covered its maiden voyage as unsinkable. The number of lifeboats is worth sitting with for a moment. 24 lifeboats for 3,000 people. Robertson did not present this as an oversight or a casual detail. He built it into the story as something that would matter, something his characters understood to be inadequate, and a fact about the ship that its owners had chosen to accept, because the ship was, after all, unsinkable, and if it could not sink, then the lifeboats were, in the end, a formality. This was not an unusual attitude in the maritime world of the 1890s. The logic was circular, and it was also, within its own terms, internally consistent. Large ships with advanced watertight compartment systems were genuinely less likely to sink than smaller, older vessels. The question of what happened when one of them sank anyway was a question the industry was not rushing to answer. Robertson's Titan struck an iceberg on an April night in the North Atlantic. The collision was on the starboard side. The ship went down. Most of the people aboard it died because there were not enough lifeboats. The novella was published in 1898 by a small New York firm called M.F. Mansfield. It appeared under the title Futility, which was the title Robertson had given it, a word that pointed towards something about his story beyond the shipwreck itself, something about ambition and engineering and the particular human confidence that very large structures produce. The book was modest in its presentation. Its cover was plain. It reached a small readership, found modest notice, and settled into the ordinary life of a book that has been published and received, and quietly moved past by the reading public, which moves past most books without much ceremony. The people who read Futility in 1898 found in it a competent maritime story with a convincing physical texture, the kind of story that reads differently when the person who wrote it has actually stood on a ship's bridge in the middle of the Atlantic at night and knows therefore what a bridge smells like, what the instruments look like, what the particular quality of darkness over deep ocean is. They did not find in it a prophecy. There was nothing in it that an informed reader would have identified as prediction rather than professional extrapolation. Robertson had taken the trends of late 19th century naval architecture, followed them forward in an imaginative but technically grounded way, and written a disaster story around the result. The disaster was plausible. It was the kind of story someone with Robertson's background would write. The book sold what it sold, was read by who read it, and then it went out of print, which is what most books do. It went out of print, and it remained out of print through the late 1890s and through the early years of the new century, while Robertson continued to write other things, stories about submarines, stories about naval combat, stories about ocean crossings, and while the ships he was writing about in the world outside his window continued to get larger. Robertson's circumstances in those years were not comfortable. The income from popular magazine fiction in the early 1900s was real but not reliable, and the gap between what Robertson needed to live and what his writing produced was often wider than it should have been. He was living in rented rooms, producing copy on a schedule, driven more by necessity than by creative momentum, working in the particular way that writers work when the rent is a present concern and the art is what happens in whatever space is left around that concern. He had a relationship with alcohol that made things harder than they might otherwise have been. None of this was unusual in the world of working writers at that time. It was the texture of a working life that had its difficulties without those difficulties being the whole of it. What he had, that many other working writers did not, was his technical knowledge. He kept writing about ships because he understood ships in a way that was genuinely uncommon among civilians, and that understanding continued to produce work that felt real in its physical details, even when the stories themselves were pulp magazine adventure. The knowledge that had come from 11 years at sea had not left him. It had simply changed form, from operational knowledge into narrative material, from the ability to sail ships into the ability to write about them with a precision that other writers faked, and Robertson did not need to. By 1905 or so, Futility was simply out of print and mostly unread. It existed in the way that out-of-print books exist, in some libraries, on some shelves, in the rooms of people who had bought it a few years earlier and not yet got around to clearing it out, in the inventory records of a publisher that had since moved on to other titles. Robertson himself had moved on to other work. The Titan, that fictional ship with its 800-foot length and its 24 lifeboats and its April iceberg and its fictional press coverage full of the word unsinkable, sat in the book that contained it, which sat wherever out-of-print books sit, which is quietly and without any particular sense of their own significance. The world outside the book was changing in ways that Robertson would have recognized. The shipping lines were building bigger. Cunard had launched the Mauretania and the Lusitania, large fast ships that captured the speed records and the public imagination simultaneously. The White Star Line, watching this, made a decision that their answer would not be speed but scale. Ships so large and so luxuriously appointed that speed would become, for certain kinds of passenger, beside the point. Plans were drawn up, numbers were committed to paper in engineering offices. The ships that those plans described were enormous. In Belfast, at the Harland and Wolff shipyard, the work of building these ships was beginning or approaching. The engineering teams were working through the particular problems that very large hulls create: how to float something of that weight, how to power it efficiently, how to keep it safe in the event of flooding. The watertight compartment systems being designed for these ships were the most advanced yet built into passenger vessels, and the people designing them were justifiably proud of what they had produced. The ships would be, as a practical matter, extraordinarily difficult to sink. None of this had anything to do with Morgan Robertson's novella, which was not being read by the engineers in Belfast, which was not being referenced in the White Star Line's planning offices, which was not influencing the decisions being made about propulsion systems or lifeboat counts or the marketing language being developed for the ship's maiden voyages. It was simply elsewhere, in a different world from the one in which actual ships were being built, sitting on whatever shelf it had ended up on, doing what out-of-print books do, which is nothing visible. In 1911, one of those ships, the one the engineers in Belfast had been fitting out since its hull was launched into the River Lagan, was nearing completion. It was a real object, steel and wood and glass and brass, built by real hands over years of work, enormous in the way that only things assembled from thousands of smaller things can be enormous. It had been named. It would sail in 1912, and Robertson's book was still on its shelf, still out of print, still unread by almost everyone alive. The fictional ship and the real one had been moving in parallel through their respective existences, one in the pages of a novella published in 1898 by a small New York firm, one in the engineering drawings and the steel and the timber of a shipyard on the River Lagan, and neither of those existences knew anything about the other. This is simply what was happening in the world in 1911. A man who had spent 11 years at sea, who had risen to first mate on Atlantic crossing vessels, who had left the sea when his eyes failed and turned his accumulated knowledge into fiction, had written a story about a large ship striking an iceberg in April with too few lifeboats. He had published it in 1898. It had gone out of print. He was now living in a rented room in New York, working at a desk, producing stories about the sea because the sea was what he understood, and because understanding something is in the absence of other options, the material you work with. The book sat where it sat. The ship was being built in Belfast. The April in which they would encounter each other, not the fiction and the steel, which cannot encounter each other, but the fiction and the fact, the written disaster and the historical one, was still months away, somewhere ahead in an ordinary calendar that had not yet been reached. Robertson would not have been thinking about his novella in 1911. A writer who has moved through dozens of stories does not keep particular attention on any one of them, especially a book that is out of print and has not been in print for over a decade. The Titan was behind him the way the sea was behind him, part of what had made him, but not the thing presently occupying the desk. The world in 1911 did not have a particular reason to think about Morgan Robertson. He was an obscure writer of maritime fiction, living in reduced circumstances, producing work for popular magazines. His earlier novella about a large liner and an iceberg was not being discussed, was not in print, was not the kind of book that editors or critics or general readers were finding their way toward. It was in the category of things that exist without being noticed, which is a large category, and one that contains most of what has ever been written. Outside a library window, or outside the window of wherever the book happened to be sitting, the ordinary world of 1911 continued. Ships were being built and launched and crewed. The Atlantic was crossed and recrossed by vessels of increasing size and sophistication. The great engineering confidence of the era, the belief that problems of construction and design could be understood and solved, that the sea could be managed by sufficiently well-made objects, was producing ships that were by any previous measure extraordinary achievements. And a book sat on a shelf, its plain cover facing outward, its pages holding a fictional ship called the Titan, and a fictional April, and a fictional iceberg, and a fictional disaster that bore a particular resemblance to something that had not yet happened, but would. That was all it was. In 1911, a book on a shelf, two things existing in parallel, one fictional and one real, one written down in a small New York publisher's office in 1898, and one being finished by hand in a Belfast shipyard, neither aware of the other, the April that would connect them, in the minds of newspapers and booksellers and readers who could not quite account for what they were looking at, still somewhere ahead, waiting in the calendar, unhurried. The book sat there. The ship was nearly ready. Wideg, the year turned, and then it was 1912, and the ordinary world continued, as ordinary worlds do, not knowing quite yet what it was carrying. 45,000 tons and 46,328 tons. Those two figures were written 14 years apart. One set down in a small publisher's office on a quiet street in New York in 1898. The other calculated by engineers working at a shipyard on the River Lagan in Belfast in the first years of the new century. They are not the same number, but for two measurements separated by 14 years and produced by entirely different people for entirely different purposes, they are close in a way that gives the eye a reason to pause. The first number belonged to a fictional ship. The second belonged to a real one. The man who wrote the first had no knowledge of the second, because the second did not yet exist when he put his pen down. What existed in 1898 was a novella about an ocean liner called the Titan, a ship described with the kind of technical specificity that comes from a writer who has spent 11 years working aboard vessels not entirely different in principle from the one he was imagining. The number on the page was the product of informed extrapolation, of watching how the ships had been growing through the 1880s and 1890s and carrying that line forward to its next reasonable point. The engineers who produced the second number were not extrapolating. They were measuring something they had drawn and were in the process of building. Their figure, 46,328 gross registered tons, was a precise accounting of a physical object that was taking shape in a Belfast dry dock, a thing that could be walked through and touched and smelled of fresh steel and paint and timber, and yet the two numbers sat, when placed beside each other, close enough that the difference between them was less than 3%. That proximity is not nothing. It is also not everything. The figures are close, and they are interesting, and they are what they are. Two measurements, one imagined and one engineered, that ended up in the same neighborhood of tonnage, because the forces shaping each of them were not entirely unrelated. The largest ships of the 1890s had already reached 30,000 tons. The direction of travel was clear. A careful observer in 1898 could see where the line was going. The length of the fictional ship was listed in the novella as 800 feet. The real ship measured 882.5 feet from bow to stern. A difference of 82 feet across a vessel of that scale is not negligible. It represents more length than many working ships of the era possessed in their entirety. And yet 800 feet and 882 feet are not figures that come from different worlds. They are figures from the same world, the world of very large Atlantic Ocean liners at the turn of the century, a world in which the ships were growing by dozens of feet with each successive generation, and in which a careful writer in 1898 could place a fictional ship at 800 feet without that figure seeming implausible to anyone who had been reading the shipping news. The numbers are the easiest comparisons to make because numbers sit still and can be written in a column and compared directly. The other parallels between the fictional Titan and the real Titanic are sometimes harder to pin down precisely because they involve descriptions rather than measurements, and descriptions depend on the words chosen and the precision of the person doing the describing, but several of them are documented clearly enough to be worth sitting with. The fictional Titan was described in the novella as triple screwed, driven by 3 propellers rather than 2 or 4. The Titanic was also triple screwed, with 1 central propeller and 2 outboard ones, an arrangement chosen for its efficiency on long Atlantic crossings. Triple screw propulsion was not universal among large liners of the era, but it was common enough among the largest ships that a technically informed writer imagining a very large ship in 1898 might well have given it 3 screws. That Robertson did, and that the real ship also had 3, is a point of correspondence. It is not a mysterious one, but it is there. The speed listed for the fictional Titan was approximately 25 knots. The Titanic's service speed was around 22 to 23 knots, with a top speed estimated at approximately 24 to 25 knots under ideal conditions. These figures overlap closely enough that a reader comparing them would not feel they were looking at different categories of vessel. Both ships were fast, both were described as among the fastest of their type, and the speeds assigned to each fell in the same range, the range that engineers and writers and ship owners of the era associated with a premier Atlantic liner pushing hard across the ocean. Speed matters in the comparison not only as a technical data point, but because of what speed meant for the collision. A ship moving at 22 or 25 knots in an ice field is a ship that has very little time between sighting an obstacle and striking it. The faster the ship, the shorter the gap between the warning and the impact, and the less room there is for any correction to make a difference. Both the fictional Titan and the real Titanic were moving quickly when they met the ice. That is part of what the comparison between them contains. The novella's author described the Titan as carrying 24 lifeboats. The real Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. Neither of those numbers was enough. The fictional ship was described as having capacity for 3,000 passengers and crew, and 24 boats were characterized within the novella as dangerously, almost criminally inadequate for that number of people. The word used in some descriptions of the fictional ship's lifeboat provision is striking precisely because it is not vague. The inadequacy is named as a problem within the story itself, not merely observable in retrospect by a reader with knowledge of what happened later. The real Titanic carried 2,224 passengers and crew on the night it sank. 20 lifeboats with a combined capacity of approximately 1,178 people. The arithmetic of that disparity is simple and does not require elaboration. What is worth noting is that the Titanic's lifeboat provision, inadequate as it was, met the legal requirements of the British Board of Trade at the time, because the regulations governing how many lifeboats a ship was required to carry had not been updated to keep pace with the growth in ship size over the preceding decade. The law had been written for smaller ships. The ships had gotten larger. The law had not moved. Robertson described that same mechanism, the tendency of regulations and safety thinking to lag behind the ambitions of builders and owners in the reasoning his fictional ship owners give for not providing more boats. There was no legal requirement to do so. The public expected the largest ships to be safe. The technology of the ships themselves was described as making disaster so improbable that the boats were viewed as symbolic rather than essential. This reasoning appears in the novella as the explanation for a tragic shortfall. It appears in the historical record as the actual explanation for a tragic shortfall. The fictional version and the documented version are not identical, but they are describing the same error. That error had a name in both versions, and the name was unsinkable. The fictional Titan was described as unsinkable by its builders and accepted as such by the press and the world of the novella, with the general understanding that a ship of its size, its compartmentalization, and its engineering represented a kind of maritime achievement that placed it beyond the reach of ordinary disaster. This language was not invented by Robertson. It was already circulating among the builders and promoters of large Atlantic liners in the 1890s, and Robertson, as someone who had spent a career at sea and had been reading the shipping press closely for years, would have been well acquainted with it. The White Star Line did not, in its official promotional materials, use the single word unsinkable in quite the emphatic way that is sometimes reported. What it did use was language that conveyed the same confidence, descriptions of the Titanic's watertight compartment system as so effective that the ship was, in a practical sense, its own lifeboat. The naval architect and marine engineer trade publication described the Olympic-class ships as being practically unsinkable in a piece published in 1911. Newspapers adopted the term. The public received it. The word settled into the general understanding of what the Titanic was, and it was a word that Robertson had already attached to his fictional ship 14 years before. The month of April sits inside the comparison as well, and this is a parallel that belongs not only to the fiction, but to the geography of the North Atlantic. Icebergs calve from Greenland glaciers throughout the year, but the spring months, and April in particular, are when the largest volumes of ice tend to drift south on the Labrador Current into the shipping lanes that connect Europe and North America. This is not a secret. It was known to every sailor and navigator who had worked the North Atlantic in the 19th century, and Robertson had been one of them. Setting a fictional iceberg collision in April was not a mysterious or arbitrary choice. It was the choice of someone who knew the ocean well enough to know when its ice was most likely to be where the ships were. The Titanic struck its iceberg on the night of the 14th of April, 1912, and disappeared below the surface in the early hours of the 15th. Robertson set his fictional collision in April. Both disasters occurred in the same month. The North Atlantic iceberg season, familiar to anyone with working knowledge of that ocean, placed both events in the same window of the calendar. This particular parallel is probably the least mysterious of the correspondences, and it is worth saying so plainly. The side of the hull that made contact with the ice is a detail that appears in both the fiction and the historical record, and it is one of the smaller, more specific matches in the comparison. Robertson wrote that the fictional Titan struck the iceberg on its starboard side. The Titanic struck its iceberg on its starboard side. The right side of the ship in both cases was the side that the ice found first. This could be explained in various ways. The standard convention of maritime fiction, the likelihood of a particular kind of evasive maneuver when a lookout spots an obstacle ahead and to the right, the fact that starboard is the right-hand side of any vessel, and that visual observations and helm responses in the era tended to follow certain predictable patterns. It is a close match. Its explanation does not require anything beyond what is ordinarily available. The speed at which the real Titanic was traveling when it struck the iceberg was approximately 22.5 knots. Wireless messages had come in throughout the day, warning of ice in the vicinity of the ship's planned route. The messages named specific coordinates, named specific ships that had encountered the ice, gave details about field ice and large bergs. The Titanic did not slow down. This is a documented fact about how that night unfolded, and it is also a fact that mirrors something in Robertson's novella, The Fictional Titan's Operators. Two chose speed over caution in the waters where the ice was known to be. The decision to maintain speed in known ice was not irrational in the context of how the ships of that era were operated. The thinking, such as it was, ran along several lines. The ships were very large and therefore considered stable in ways smaller vessels were not. The watch officers were experienced and believed a lookout would spot any significant obstacle in time to make a course correction. The competitive pressure to maintain crossing times was real, economically and reputationally. These were the conditions under which both a fictional shipowner writing in 1898 and a real ship's officers operating in 1912 might choose to keep speed rather than reduce it. Robertson understood those conditions because he had worked inside them. What he had also understood, and what the historical record subsequently confirmed, was that a very large ship moving at high speed does not respond to helm input the way a smaller, slower vessel does. The mass involved, the momentum accumulated, the time required to change heading, these were physical realities that Robertson knew from his years at sea and built into his fictional scenario as part of what made the collision unavoidable once it was nearly upon the crew. The 45,000 fictional tons moving at speed had very little room to turn. The 46,000 real tons had very little room to turn. The physics were the same in both cases, because the physics were not invented by Robertson, but borrowed from a world he had navigated himself. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge the differences, because the differences exist and matter. Robertson's fictional Titan sank in a single piece. The Titanic broke apart between its third and fourth funnels as it went down, a fact confirmed by the discovery of the wreck and the location of the bow and stern sections on the ocean floor. Robertson described his fictional ship striking the iceberg and rolling over, capsizing rather than flooding, and sinking bow first. The Titanic foundered progressively, taking on water through the damaged sections of its forward hull over the course of 2 hours and 40 minutes before the hull failed. The mode of the sinking in the two versions is quite different. Robertson's fictional ship was somewhat shorter and somewhat lighter than the real one, as the figures established. The fictional Titan appears to have been a somewhat different shape internally from the Titanic, though the novella is not a naval engineering document and does not give a complete technical picture. The fictional ship had fewer passengers aboard than the real one, though both were described as carrying far more people than their boats could hold. There was no wireless telegraphy in Robertson's story. The technology existed in 1898, but had not yet been deployed aboard merchant ships, and its absence from the novella is not surprising. These differences deserve the same calm attention as the similarities, because leaving them out would produce a comparison that is more tidy than it is true. The Titan and the Titanic are not the same ship. They are a fictional ship and a real one that happen to share a set of features close enough that when placed side by side, the correspondence is genuinely interesting. The interesting part is real. The differences are also real. Both of these things can be held at the same time, and holding both of them produces a clearer picture than holding only the similarities. The tonnage figure is still perhaps the closest single parallel, not because tonnage is the most dramatic comparison, but because it is the most precisely measurable one. Numbers do not expand or contract depending on how they are described. 45,000 and 46,328 are fixed. They are what they are, and placed side by side, they are close enough that a person reading them with no prior knowledge of either ship would be forgiven for thinking the same hand had written both. The word that does the most work in any account of the Titan and the Titanic, and the word worth examining most carefully, is probably the word prescient. It appears in every popular retelling of the Robertson story, applied to the novella as a kind of label, and it carries within it a sense of looking ahead that implies something more than ordinary observation. Prescient means seeing beforehand. It carries the shadow of something that cannot quite be accounted for by ordinary means. Robertson's novella was prescient in the narrower, more precise sense of the word. It described conditions and outcomes that came to pass. Whether that description required anything beyond careful professional observation and a working knowledge of how ships were being built and operated in the 1890s is a different question, and the answer, examined honestly, is probably no. Robertson knew what the largest ships of his era looked like and how they were being made to grow. He knew what the North Atlantic ice field did to ships moving through it at speed. He knew what happened when a large vessel struck a solid obstacle at a substantial fraction of its maximum speed. He knew what inadequate lifeboat provision meant in practice. These were not mysterious insights. They were the insights of a working mariner who had paid attention to the right things. What made the novella seem prescient was not that Robertson saw something others could not see. What made it seem prescient was that a specific disaster, matching a fictional one in several documented ways, actually occurred. The match was not inevitable. Another maritime disaster might have happened first, or might have dominated the public conversation: a boiler explosion, a fire at sea, a collision between two ships in fog, and futility would have remained unread. Its fictional titan never placed beside any real catastrophe. The comparison exists because the Titanic sank. It did not become visible until then. There is a useful and honest way to think about what Robertson actually did, which is to note that he extrapolated competently from a set of real trends in a direction those trends were already moving, and that his extrapolation proved close enough to one specific real outcome that the comparison is worth making. What he could not have done, even with the most precise technical knowledge available to him in 1898, was know which particular ship, on which particular night, in which particular year, would be the one to follow the pattern he was sketching. He was describing a type of disaster. The type occurred. One disaster within that type happened to be the Titanic. The April night on the North Atlantic is a fixture in both the fictional and the historical version of this story. The darkness is in both accounts, and the ice is in both, and the ship moving at speed through a cold ocean towards something it has not yet seen. The fictional version ends with the Titan on its side, in the water, the survivors in the sea, the ship gone. The historical version ends with the Titanic broken apart on the ocean floor, and more than 1,500 people lost. The outcomes share their weight, but not their exact shape. The starboard hull of the fictional ship and the starboard hull of the real one each made contact with ice on an April night. The curve of the steel, the particular angle of contact, the side that bore the damage, these details appear in both accounts and match. The ocean on both sides of the event was the same ocean, the same dark water running very cold in April, the same lanes used by ships crossing between Europe and America on routes that had been established for generations and that ran in April through the zone where the Greenland ice tended to appear. A ship's hull in darkness is a specific thing: the long wall of it, the riveted steel, the particular sound that water makes against a surface that large when the surface is moving and the water is not. Robertson had stood on ships at night in the North Atlantic, and he knew what that darkness felt like from the deck, and he knew what the water sounded like, and he knew what the hull looked like from a lifeboat. He put that knowledge into the Titan. The Titan's hull and the Titanic's hull both met the ice on the right side, moving fast, in April in the dark. That is the last and perhaps the simplest of the correspondences. The starboard side, in the dark, in April, moving fast. Four things that appear in the fiction and in the historical record, described by different people for different purposes. One set describing something that had not yet happened, and one set recording something that had. The long curve of steel, the moment of contact, the cold water on the right side of the hull. Robertson had written that. The Atlantic had provided it. And the word starboard sits in both accounts, a small precise word that means the right side of any ship, whatever that ship's name, whatever the year. The full set of documented comparisons between the fictional Titan and the real Titanic, held together in the mind, produces a particular feeling, not alarm, not the sense of something uncanny or threatening, but something closer to the feeling of finding two photographs, taken decades apart by different people, that show the same tree, the same angle, the same quality of afternoon light. The photographs are interesting because of their correspondence. The correspondence does not require explanation beyond the fact that a tree in a particular place will catch the afternoon light in the same way regardless of who is photographing it or when. The largest ships of the North Atlantic in the late 19th century were all tending in the same direction. They were getting longer, heavier, faster. Their operators were competing on size and luxury. Their safety provisions were being outpaced by their ambitions. Their press coverage was emphasizing invulnerability and engineering triumph. An attentive person in 1898 could read those trends and write about where they were going. Robertson read them and wrote about where they were going. Where they were going was eventually an April night in the North Atlantic, a starboard hull, and a darkness very wide and very cold around a great ship that was moving forward at speed. The documented parallels are what they are, several specific and measurable, others more general, all of them products of an informed imagination working from real conditions rather than anything that falls outside the ordinary range of careful professional observation. The numbers on the page from 1898 and the numbers on the engineering drawings from Belfast sit close enough together that the closeness is real and worth acknowledging. The month is the same month, the side is the same side, the speed is in the same range. The lifeboat problem is the same problem described by the same logic. What sits between those two existences, the fictional ship and the real one, is 14 years of ordinary time, during which the real ship was designed and built and fitted out and launched and staffed and sailed. During those 14 years, Robertson's novella sat largely unread on the shelves of the people who had bought it, and in the storage rooms of a small publisher, and in the occasional library collection that had received a copy. The fictional Titan existed in those pages without knowing anything about what was being built in Belfast. The Titanic was built in Belfast without any knowledge of the fictional Titan. The two things ran parallel, each in its own medium, one in ink, one in steel, until the night in April when the real one met the ice on its starboard side, and the two existences became, for the first time, part of the same story. The starboard hull, moving through dark water in April at speed. The long curved wall of it, the rivets along the seams, the cold ocean on the other side of the steel. That image exists in both the fiction and the record, described in each by the logic of what a large fast ship does in those waters at that time of year when the ice has drifted down to where the shipping lanes are. And it rests there, in the dark, on the right side, the hull moving forward, a quiet and specific thing that two very different accounts happen to share, without either one having sought the correspondence, the ocean between them, wide and cold, and entirely indifferent to what either of them had written. The Titanic's hull entered the River Lagan on May 31st, 1911, just before noon, and the water moved out of its way in a long, low wave that rolled toward both banks at once. 100,000 people stood along the shore to watch. The sound the water made as the bow cut into it carried across the crowd before the cheering did. A deep and particular displacement, a noise more felt in the chest than heard with the ears. The hull was painted black to the waterline, the exposed steel above it a pale oxide red, and as it gathered speed in the slipway, the sheer size of it produced a kind of silence in the people closest to the bank, the way very large things often do, not awe in the performed sense, but a brief suspension of the ordinary, the brain pausing to reconcile what the eyes were reporting. The shipyard that built her was called Harland and Wolff, and it occupied a considerable stretch of the Belfast waterfront, its two enormous gantry cranes visible for miles across the flat land surrounding the city. The keel had been laid on March 31st, 1909, in the same slipway where her sister ship, the Olympic, had been laid just 2 months earlier. The two hulls rising side by side through 1909 and into 1910, then 1911, the scaffolding around them growing as they grew, the workforce climbing higher as the ships climbed higher. At the height of construction, the shipyard employed close to 15,000 people, most of them from Belfast and the surrounding counties, and the noise of the place on a working morning, the riveting hammers, the plate-cutting machinery, the overhead cranes carrying sections of hull across the yard, was something that could be heard well beyond the shipyard walls, a constant percussion that the city had long since incorporated into its ordinary background. The keel laying on March 31st, 1909, was not accompanied by any particular ceremony. A keel is simply the first structural piece, the long spine along which everything else is built, and in a working shipyard it is placed without speeches. The men on that day would have laid it in the same practical spirit they brought to everything else, straight, level, secured, ready for what comes next. What came next was 2 years of assembly, the frames rising from the keel like ribs, the deck beams going in across them, the hull plating being riveted in sections from the bottom up, and the whole shape emerging slowly from the yard in the way that large fabricated things emerge, not as a sudden appearance, but as a long accumulation, each week indistinguishably similar to the week before, until one morning someone standing far enough back could see the outline of what it was going to be. The decision to build her had been made several years earlier, at a dinner in 1907 between Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, and Lord William Peary, the head of Harland and Wolff. What they were responding to was a problem of competition. Cunard, their principal rival in the transatlantic passenger trade, had just launched the Mauretania and the Lusitania, two ships designed around speed, both of them capable of crossing the Atlantic faster than anything the White Star Line could currently offer. Ismay and Peary looked at this situation and decided not to match Cunard on their own terms. Speed required power, and power required coal, and coal was expensive, and a fast crossing still ended at the same dock as a slow one. What they proposed instead was a different kind of appeal entirely, not speed but scale, not the record-breaking sprint but the floating palace, ships so large and so comfortable that the crossing itself became the attraction rather than something to be endured. They sketched the outlines of 3 ships on that evening, ships that would be the largest moving objects ever built, and the conversation that produced them was by most accounts entirely calm and businesslike, the way conversations about large capital expenditures tend to be. The Titanic's dimensions were settled in the engineering offices at Harland and Wolff in the years that followed that dinner, the drawings going back and forth between the design teams, the specifications being refined and refined again. She would be 882, 5 feet long. Her gross registered tonnage would be 46,328 tons. She would carry 3 propellers, 2 wing propellers driven by reciprocating triple expansion steam engines, and a central propeller driven by a low-pressure steam turbine, drawing on the exhaust steam from the reciprocating engines to extract additional efficiency from the same fuel. Her intended service speed was approximately 21 to 22 knots, not the fastest on the Atlantic, but fast enough for a comfortable schedule, and fast enough that on a clear night in open water, she presented a considerable challenge to anything placed unexpectedly in her path. The engineering that went into her was genuinely state-of-the-art by the standards of 1908 and 1909, the best available application of what marine architects and steam engineers had accumulated over 60 years of building large ocean-going vessels. Inside, she was being built to a standard that had no real precedent at sea. The first-class interiors were designed by the firm of Aldham Heaton and Company, working from a brief that called for the atmosphere of the great London and Paris hotels of the period, which themselves had been designed to suggest the houses of the very wealthy wood paneling in the Georgian style, plasterwork ceilings, carpeting of a weight and pattern that implied stability, permanence, a connection to the land, even when the land was 1,000 miles away in any direction. A first-class dining saloon could seat 554 people and occupied the full width of the ship on D-deck, its tables set with White Star Line china and silverware, the room lit by electric lighting arranged to approximate the warmth of candlelight. There was a first-class swimming bath, a gymnasium equipped with mechanical rowing machines and cycling apparatus, a squash court, a Turkish bath suite with a cooling room finished in blue and green tiles in an ori pattern, and a café Parisien on the starboard side of B-deck, where wicker furniture and a trellis of climbing ivy had been arranged to suggest, as closely as possible, the pavement outside a Paris brasserie. The fittings were made and installed while the ship was moored at the Deepwater Wharf in Belfast after her launch, the interior work taking the better part of 10 months, the carpenters and upholsterers and electricians moving through her decks while the engineers finished the machinery below. Third class was different in every respect. The third-class cabins were below the waterline at the bow and stern, functional rooms with 4 or 6 berths arranged in tiers, and the common areas were clean and plain, the furniture bolted to the deck, the meals served on plain crockery at long tables. The difference in comfort between first and third class was substantial enough that the 2 groups of passengers existed, for most purposes, on entirely separate ships that happened to occupy the same hull. The people who booked third-class passage on the Titanic were largely emigrants, men and women from County Cork and County Limerick, from Norway and Sweden, from Croatia and Syria and Finland and Poland, people who had made the decision, often at considerable personal cost, to leave the places where they had been born and make the crossing to America in the hope of something better. Their reasons varied: failed harvests, poverty, limited opportunity, family members already established in New York or Boston or Chicago, letters sent home describing wages and conditions that seemed from the receiving end almost impossible to believe. They boarded with what they could carry. The Titanic left Southampton on April 10th, 1912, at approximately 12:15 in the afternoon. Southampton's ocean dock was the largest graving dock in the world at that time, built specifically to accommodate ships of the Olympic class, and the Titanic occupied it as though she had been placed there by measurement. The morning of April 10th was clear and mild, the kind of English spring day that arrives without drama. The air still cool, but the light already carrying the particular quality of late morning sun across open water. Captain Edward John Smith was on the bridge. Smith was 62 years old, a tall man with a white beard that had become, over the course of his career, something of a public face for the White Star Line. He had commanded the Olympic on her maiden voyage the year before, and his selection for the Titanic's maiden crossing was understood by everyone involved as an appropriate farewell appointment, a final prestigious command before the retirement he had been contemplating for some time. He had spent more than 40 years at sea by 1912, and had commanded more transatlantic crossings than he could easily count. The departure from Southampton did not go entirely without incident. As the Titanic moved slowly out of the dock, the displacement of water from her enormous hull created a suction effect along the dock wall, powerful enough to snap the mooring ropes of the ocean liner, SS New York, which was moored nearby. The New York swung outward toward the Titanic's stern with enough momentum to suggest a collision was possible, and Captain Smith ordered the engines stopped. The tugboats attending the departure managed to bring the New York under control. The gap between the two hulls at the closest point was later estimated at about 4 feet. The whole episode lasted approximately an hour, after which the Titanic resumed her way down Southampton water toward the Solent and the open channel. Most accounts suggest the passengers watching from the decks found it an interesting spectacle rather than an alarming one, a demonstration, perhaps, of how large the ship was, how much water she moved simply by existing and traveling through it. She stopped at Cherbourg on the evening of April 10th to take on additional passengers tendered out from shore, then continued to Queenstown on the southern coast of Ireland, arriving on the morning of April 11th. Queenstown was the last European port of call, the last place where letters could be posted, the last place where anyone who had changed their mind could still disembark. A number of passengers did disembark there, and others boarded, most of them emigrants from County Cork and the surrounding counties, taking third-class passage to America. The ship anchored in the harbor, and the tenders came out carrying the new passengers, their luggage and bags loaded into the lower holds, and the people themselves making their way up the gangways and onto a ship that from the waterline rose above them to a height that was difficult to take in all at once. The Irish coast was visible to the north and west, green and low under a cloud that was moving in from the Atlantic, and at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, the Titanic weighed anchor and turned her bow toward the open sea. The North Atlantic in April is not the worst version of itself. The worst version, the storms of November and December, the gales that could make even large ships uncomfortable and slow, was still months away. April on the North Atlantic tends to run toward cold clarity, days of good visibility under high pressure, nights that are very dark, and at the latitudes the Titanic was traveling, genuinely cold. The surface of the sea on a calm April night in those waters could be almost perfectly flat, a condition that ocean-going sailors called a flat calm, and which sounds restful in description, but carries its own peculiar difficulty for anyone trying to spot something at a distance, because the lack of swell means there is no wave breaking white against the base of an obstruction, and no sound to travel across the water toward a listening ear. The route the Titanic was following in April 1912 was the standard westbound North Atlantic track, a great arc dipping south of the direct course between Ireland and New York in order to take advantage of favorable currents and avoid the worst of the North Atlantic weather. The route had been adjusted southward for the winter season and had not yet been moved back to its summer position, which would have taken the ship somewhat farther north. The position of the track in April placed it in a region of the North Atlantic where icebergs calving from glaciers on the west coast of Greenland had by that time of year drifted far enough south on the Labrador Current to present a hazard to shipping. This was not unknown. It was not a surprise. The presence of ice in this region in April was well understood by anyone who had spent time on the transatlantic run, and the wireless equipment that the Titanic carried, Marconi equipment, operated by two wireless operators named Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, was capable of receiving messages from other ships with observations of ice positions during the crossing. The Titanic's hull had been divided into a series of watertight compartments, separated by 15 transverse bulkheads running across the width of the ship. The designers had calculated that the ship could remain afloat with any two of these compartments flooded, or with the 4 forward compartments flooded, or with any combination of up to 4 non-adjacent compartments flooded. This calculation was accurate as far as it went. The arrangement of the bulkheads and the flotation characteristics of the hull had been worked out carefully, and the conclusion the designers reached that the ship could survive a significant degree of flooding was a reasonable conclusion given the design as they understood it. The White Star Line's promotional materials described the watertight compartment system in terms that suggested sinking was a practical impossibility, and the press used similar language. The word unsinkable appeared in a number of contexts in connection with both the Olympic and the Titanic, though it is worth observing that the naval architects at Harland and Wolff used rather more measured language in their actual technical documents, and that the word appears to have been adopted more enthusiastically by journalists and marketing writers than by the people who had done the engineering. The design contained a limitation that was not emphasized in promotional materials. Each of the 15 transverse bulkheads rose to a different height within the ship, and several of them, including 5 of the 6 forward bulkheads, which were most critical in the event of a bow-first flooding scenario, did not extend all the way to the uppermost watertight deck. The top of bulkhead E, for instance, the bulkhead between the 5th and 6th watertight compartments from the bow, reached only to E deck. The practical consequence of this was that if flooding in the forward compartments caused the bow to settle deeper in the water would eventually rise high enough to spill over the top of the lower bulkheads from one compartment into the next, in sequence, like water filling the compartments of an ice tray tilted at one end. The ship could survive flooding in any 4 compartments because in that scenario, the bow would not settle far enough for the water to reach the tops of the bulkheads. It could not survive flooding in 5 or more forward compartments because in that scenario, the geometry worked against it. This was a limitation that had been identified in the design process. It had been evaluated and considered against the practical likelihood of a scenario in which 5 or more forward compartments were simultaneously open to the sea, a scenario that the designers regarded as sufficiently extreme that the probability was low enough to accept. The bulkheads were drawn on drafting paper to the heights that were specified. The specifications were approved. The steel was cut and fitted to those heights. The ship was built exactly as the drawings required. The limitation existed inside the completed vessel in the same quiet way that all engineering compromises exist inside the things they were made to inhabit, as a choice made at a particular moment, with the information available at the time, by people who were applying their best judgment to a problem that had not yet presented itself. The ship's 20 lifeboats were stowed on the boat deck. the highest open deck running the length of the ship. The davits that held them were of the Welland radial type, a relatively new design capable of handling more than one boat each, which meant that the Titanic's davit system could technically have accommodated more lifeboats than were actually carried. The decision to carry 20 boats was not made carelessly. It was made in compliance with the British Board of Trade's regulations governing the number of lifeboats required on a passenger vessel, regulations that had been written in 1894 and based on a formula relating to a ship's gross tonnage rather than the number of people it carried. The Titanic's 20 boats, 16 standard wooden lifeboats, and 4 collapsible canvas-sided Engelhart boats could between them carry approximately 1,178 people. The ship was certified to carry 3,547 passengers and crew, and on her maiden voyage carried approximately 2,224 people. This meant that the available lifeboat capacity was sufficient for roughly half the people aboard, a number that exceeded what the Board of Trade required. The Board of Trade's requirements had not been updated since the 1890s, in a period when the largest ships on the Atlantic carried considerably fewer people than the Olympic class, and the gap between the regulations and the reality of what the ships now carried had not prompted a revision. Bruce Ismay and others in the White Star Line had considered carrying additional lifeboats and had decided against it, partly on aesthetic grounds. Additional boats on the boat deck would have reduced the amount of open space that first-class passengers expected, and partly because the existing complement was believed to be sufficient for what lifeboats were designed to do, which was not to save everyone at once, but to ferry passengers in repeated trips from a stricken ship to a rescue vessel standing nearby. The assumption built into the lifeboat calculation was that there would be another ship standing nearby. This assumption was not peculiar to the White Star Line or to the Titanic. It was the general maritime assumption of the era, held across the industry, and it was grounded in the fact that the Atlantic shipping lanes were well traveled and that wireless telegraphy had made it possible to summon help from considerable distances in a way that had not been possible a decade earlier. The sea trials had taken place on April 2nd, 1912, in Belfast Lough and the waters off the Irish coast. The ship's engines and steering and stopping distances were tested over the course of a single day, the Titanic performing a series of maneuvers watched by representatives of the Board of Trade. The stopping distance from full ahead had been measured, the steering had been checked, the watertight door mechanisms had been tested. The Board of Trade surveyor issued the passenger certificate the same day, and 2 days later the Titanic sailed to Southampton under her own power. The sea trials were brief by later standards, but they were not unusual for the period, and the ship had performed as expected. Her handling characteristics were consistent with her size, which meant that she was not quick to turn and not quick to stop, both of which were understood characteristics of a vessel of her dimensions, and neither of which was regarded as a defect. Southampton, in the first days of April 1912, was busy with the preparations for departure. The loading of coal, provisions, and passenger luggage occupied the better part of 3 days. The crew was signed on at the shipping office in Southampton, most of them drawn from the same pool of experienced maritime workers who staffed the Atlantic liners, officers coming from the White Star Line's established ranks, and stewards and engineers hired for the voyage in the standard way. The crew manifest listed 885 people. The passenger manifest listed 1,317 people when the ship left Queenstown, a number that made the Titanic, on this voyage, carrying well below her maximum capacity, a circumstance partly attributable to the ongoing coal strike in Britain that had reduced public confidence in sea travel and caused some passengers to rebook on other vessels. The fitting out of the ship's final details had continued until the last days before departure. The library books were loaded and shelved. The provisions for the voyage, 75,000 pounds of meat, 11,000 pounds of fresh fish, 25,000 pounds of poultry and game, 40,000 eggs, 40 tons of potatoes, 1,000 loaves of bread produced daily in the ship's bakeries, were stowed in the refrigerated holds and storerooms. The first-class passenger list included figures from American and British Industrial Society. John Jacob Astor, 4, one of the wealthiest men in the world; Isidore Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store; Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune; Lady Duff Gordon, the fashion designer. These were people accustomed to a standard of physical comfort that the ship had been designed to meet, and the ship met it. The first-class staterooms in the midship section of B&C decks were as comfortable as anything available in the hotels of London or New York, which was the comparison the White Star Line's marketing had been drawing since the ship was announced. The Titanic carried a wireless range of approximately 400 miles in daylight conditions and up to 2,000 miles at night, when atmospheric conditions were favorable. The two operators, Phillips and Bride, maintained a continuous schedule through the ship's crossing, handling a substantial volume of passenger messages, social telegrams, business instructions, personal correspondence, in addition to navigational communications from other ships and from shore stations. The volume of passenger traffic that needed to be processed placed a practical burden on the operators, and the navigational messages they received, though they handled them and passed them to the bridge, were sometimes handled in a sequence that reflected the volume of work the operators were managing. This was not negligence. It was the ordinary condition of a wireless room on a busy Atlantic liner in 1912, where the service was still relatively new and the norms around its use were still being established, and where the commercial messages that passengers paid for were in the operator's practical understanding of their job as much their responsibility as anything else coming across the wire. On the evening of April 14th, the Titanic was approximately 400 miles south of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, making good speed in calm conditions, the sea flat, and the night very clear and very cold. The air temperature had been dropping through the afternoon. The officers on the bridge had been aware of ice in the vicinity from the messages received during the day. The ship was running without reducing speed. Captain Smith had retired to his quarters after a dinner party in the a la carte restaurant. First Officer William Murdoch had the watch. The lookouts in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, could see the horizon clearly, but had reported that the night was very dark, the stars bright but no moon, and that they were watching for ice without the aid of binoculars, which were not available to them in the crow's nest on this crossing. A pair had been stored aboard, but the key to the locker containing them had apparently been left behind in Southampton, and a replacement pair had not been sourced. What the crew of the Titanic understood about the design of their ship, about the specific combination of characteristics that made it what it was, the proportions of the hull, the height of the bulkheads, the handling characteristics of a vessel that displaced more than 46,000 tons, was substantial. They were experienced maritime professionals who had taken the ship from Belfast to Southampton and across the first 4 days of the North Atlantic without incident, and the systems they were operating functioned as they had been designed to function. The drawing of the bulkheads that had been made in the drafting offices at Harland and Wolff was inside the ship around them, translated from paper into steel, doing exactly what it had been built to do, which was to compartmentalize the hull and divide it from itself. It was a good drawing. It was carefully made. It had been approved by the appropriate people and signed off by the Board of Trade, and built with the skill of thousands of workers over more than 2 years in the best shipyard in the world. The drawing existed inside the ship as the ship moved through the flat, dark water of the North Atlantic. On the evening of April 14th, the engines turning, the watch changing, the wireless room processing its messages, the first-class passengers finishing their dinners and moving toward the smoking room and the reading room and the staterooms where their luggage had been unpacked and put away by their stewards. The drawing of the bulkheads was behind the walls and under the floors, in the unseen geometry of the hull, the place where all the considered decisions about how to build the ship had settled into a permanent form. The lines on the paper in Belfast and the lines of steel in the ship were the same lines. One set had been drawn by a hand holding a pen on a clean sheet of drafting paper, in an office that smelled of ink and machine oil. The other set was the ship itself, moving west across the wide, cold, dark Atlantic, exactly as it had been made to move. What existed in that ship, on that evening, in the most ordinary sense, was a piece of engineering work of which the builders had every reason to be proud, a structure of genuine complexity and genuine ambition, made by a great number of people working to a high standard, embodying the best available understanding of what a large passenger vessel should be and how it should be built. The decision about the bulkhead heights had been made and incorporated, and was now simply part of the fabric of the thing, sitting in the steel the way that any design decision sits in the object it produced, neither visible nor invisible, neither a problem nor a certainty, simply the shape that had been chosen and built, and was now traveling through the North Atlantic on a clear, cold April night. The drafting paper itself, back in the offices at Harland and Wolff in Belfast, was sitting in its filing cabinet in the ordinary company of hundreds of other drawings for hundreds of other ships and parts of ships, the bulkhead cross-section among them, its clean lines describing the heights and positions of the transverse frames that divided the hull, the pencil marks still clean on the white surface. The drawing had been completed, the ship had been built, nothing more was required of the paper. It held its information in the quiet way that drawings hold information, in the specificity of the lines, in the dimensions noted in the margins, in the approval signatures in the corner, in the date it had been completed and filed. Outside the filing cabinet, in Belfast in early April 1912. The spring was arriving in the ordinary way. It arrived every year, the same mild air and longer evenings, and the shipyard on the waterfront was already building the next ship, the cranes already moving, the noise of the riveters already carrying out over the city. On the afternoon of April 14th, 1912, a small stack of paper slips sat in a tray on the bridge of the Titanic. Each one had come in by wireless. Each one named a different ship. Each one said, in its own way, that there was ice ahead. The first had arrived that morning from the Caronia, reporting bergs and growlers and field ice at a specific set of coordinates along the transatlantic route. A few hours later, the Baltic relayed a warning from another vessel, noting large quantities of field ice at a position that sat squarely across the Titanic's intended path. The America reported 2 large icebergs. The Noordam noted ice in the same general region. The messages came in at intervals through the afternoon, each one a different ship's voice, each one adding to a picture that was becoming, message by message, fairly consistent. The wireless operators received them, logged them, and passed them along. The Titanic continued at close to full speed through the brightening afternoon and into the early dark. The water temperature had been dropping throughout the day, This was a known indicator. Experienced North Atlantic officers understood that a sharp drop in sea temperature often meant ice in the near vicinity, that the cold spread outward from bergs and field ice in a way that a careful watch on the thermometer could track. By late afternoon, the temperature had fallen noticeably, and by the time full darkness arrived, it was cold enough on deck that most passengers had retreated indoors. The ship moved through a night that was clear and calm, and almost entirely without wind. This was, in one sense, unfortunate. A calm sea offered no warning. Under normal conditions, waves breaking against the base of an iceberg produce a rim of white water that can be spotted at some distance, even in darkness. On a rough night, the ocean announces the obstacle. On a flat, windless night in April, an iceberg the color of old salt can sit against a dark sky and offer very little to the eye until the eye is already close. The night of April 14th was that kind of night. The stars were clear overhead. The ocean was an almost perfect mirror. There was no moon. Up in the crow's nest, positioned on the forward mast above the bridge, two lookouts named Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee had been on watch since 10 o'clock. The crow's nest was a circular steel basket, exposed on all sides to the moving air, and at the speed the ship was traveling, the cold would have been noticeable. They had no binoculars. The ship's binoculars were locked in a storeroom, the key for which had been left behind in Southampton by an officer transferred off the ship at the last moment, a minor administrative matter that had not been resolved before departure. Fleet and Lee were watching with their eyes alone, and the night was the kind of dark that asks a great deal of unassisted eyes. The Messabus sent a warning at approximately 9:40 p.m. It described an extensive ice field and noted that the Titanic was sailing directly toward it. The wireless operator on duty, Harold Bride, acknowledged receipt of the message. There is evidence that the warning was not passed to the bridge. By that point, the wireless room was occupied with a backlog of private passenger messages bound for Cape Race, a relay station on the Newfoundland coast, and the commercial traffic took precedence. The Mesaba's warning, among the clearest and most specific of the day, sat in the wireless room while the ship continued through the dark. At 11:40 p.m., Frederick Fleet saw something. What he saw was darker than the sky behind it and had a particular shape. He described it as a dark mass, appearing at first small and growing rapidly as the ship closed on it. He reached for the telephone on the wall of the crow's nest and rang the bridge 3 times, the signal for an obstruction ahead, and when the officer answered, Fleet said the words that had been building all evening without the ship's company knowing it. Iceberg, right ahead. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch heard the warning and responded almost immediately. He ordered the helmsman to turn hard a starboard, which in the conventions of the era meant turning the ship's bow to port, away from the obstruction. He rang the engine room telegraph to stop, and then to reverse. These were the correct responses, given in the correct order, and given quickly. The problem was that a ship of the Titanic's size, 882 feet of hull, driven by 3 enormous propellers, does not answer a helm change the way a small vessel does. There is an interval, a gap between the order and the consequence, during which the ship continues along its existing path while the mechanisms of turning and slowing gather themselves into effect. That interval was approximately 37 seconds. In 37 seconds, at the speed the Titanic was traveling, the gap between the iceberg and the bow closed entirely. The collision, when it came, was not the catastrophic explosion of sound that the night seemed to call for. Passengers who were still awake in their cabins reported a scraping, a rumble, a shudder that moved through the hull and then stopped. Some described it as a moderate jolt, no worse than a train coupling. Some slept through it entirely. The officers on the bridge heard the grinding and felt the vibration in the deck under their feet, and then the ship was past the iceberg, and the night was quiet again. Murdoch ordered the watertight doors closed. The Titanic came to a slow stop on a calm and still and starlit ocean. Below the waterline, what had happened was more significant than the sound suggested. The iceberg had made contact with the starboard side of the hull along an extended section of the bow, and the contact had not punched a single hole, but had instead buckled and separated the steel plates in a long intermittent path, allowing water to enter the hull in several places simultaneously. The ship's designer had intended the watertight compartment system to keep her afloat with any 2 or even any 3 or 4 compartments open to flooding, and under some scenarios, 5 compartments could flood without the ship being lost. The iceberg had breached 6. Within 45 minutes of the collision, the men who understood the ship's design had understood what that meant. Captain Edward John Smith, who had been in his quarters and had come to the bridge immediately after the collision, received Thomas Andrews's assessment of the damage at some point around midnight. Andrews was the Harland and Wolff engineer who had overseen the Titanic's construction and knew every calculation in its design. He had gone below with the carpenter to see what the flooding looked like, and when he returned, his assessment was that the ship had an hour and a half, perhaps 2 hours. There was no scenario in which the outcome was different. The flooding was sequential, one compartment after another, and the mathematics of it were not negotiable. Smith heard this and gave the order to uncover the lifeboats. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. Fully loaded to their rated capacities, they could accommodate approximately 1,178 people. There were 2,224 people aboard. The number of lifeboats the ship carried was, as it happened, more than what the British Board of Trade required for a vessel of the Titanic's size, because the regulations had not been updated since before ships of this size existed. The regulations assumed a smaller world. The ship had been built inside a set of rules that the ship itself had outgrown, and no one in the relevant offices had moved quickly enough to notice. 20 lifeboats on a ship carrying 2,224 people was a legal complement. The distinction between legal and sufficient was the space in which more than 1,500 people would die that night. The loading of lifeboats began at approximately 12:45 in the morning. Lifeboat number 7 was the first to be lowered, swung out on its davits on the starboard side of the boat deck, and sent down toward the water, carrying 28 people against a rated capacity of 65. The Titanic was brightly lit. The ocean below was a very long distance down and very dark and very cold, and the lifeboat looked small against the vast black surface it was descending toward. The passengers who had been roused from their cabins and brought up to the boat deck stood in the cold and assessed their choices: the lit ship or the small boat, and the dark ocean. And in the early stages of the loading, many chose the ship. Stewards urged them forward. The officers encouraged them. Some women refused to leave their husbands. Some passengers declined to believe the ship was in danger. The loading was slow, and the boats went down with empty seats. The conditions were not uniform across the ship. In first class, on the upper decks, the process was orderly, and the officers were accessible, and the passengers had been clearly informed. In third class, the situation was considerably more complicated. Third-class passengers were housed in the lower decks and in the stern sections of the ship, separated from the upper decks by a physical structure that reflected the social architecture of the era. The passageways between third class and the boat deck were not obvious to people who had never navigated the ship before, and the information reaching those decks was slower and less consistent. Some third-class passengers found their way to the boats. A substantial number did not. The survival figures recorded afterward showed the gap plainly. Of first-class passengers, approximately 62% survived the sinking. Of those in third class, approximately 25% survived. The numbers do not require commentary. They carry their own weight. Through all of this, there was a ship visible on the horizon. Officers on the Titanic's deck could see its lights, low on the water, perhaps 8 to 10 miles distant. They attempted to contact it by wireless and received no response. They attempted to signal it with a Morse lamp. The signals went unanswered. At approximately 12:45 a.m., the Titanic began firing distress rockets, standard white rockets of the type used in maritime emergencies, launching them one after another into the sky above the ship, each one climbing and bursting at high altitude in a shower of white stars that was visible for miles in every direction. The ship that could see the Titanic's lights was the SS Californian. The Californian was a medium-sized cargo and passenger vessel operated by the Leyland Line, and she had stopped for the night approximately somewhere between 10 and 20 miles from where the Titanic was sinking. She had stopped because her own officers had judged it unwise to continue through ice in the dark, a judgment that, under the circumstances, was sound. Her wireless operator, a man named Cyril Evans, had gone to sleep at approximately 11:30 p.m., not long before the Titanic struck the iceberg. The Californian's wireless was therefore not manned during any part of the night when the Titanic was sending distress calls. On the Californian's bridge, however, officers were awake and on watch. Second Officer Herbert Stone and Apprentice Officer James Gibson observed a ship in the distance and noted that she appeared to be firing rockets. Stone reported this to Captain Stanley Lord, who had retired to the chart room and was lying on a settee. Lord asked whether they were company signals, private color-coded signals that shipping lines used to identify their vessels to each other, and was told they appeared to be white rockets, which were not typically used as company signals. Lord acknowledged this and gave no further orders. He went back to rest. Over the following hours, Stone and Gibson watched several more rockets climb from the distant ship and burst in the dark. The distant ship's lights appeared to change in appearance as though she was moving strangely, and eventually her lights disappeared entirely. Stone noted in his log that a ship which had been firing rockets was now gone, and he did not record any interpretation of what this might mean. The American inquiry into the disaster concluded that the Californian had been close enough to render assistance, and that Captain Lord's decision not to respond to the rockets constituted a failure of duty. The British inquiry reached a similar conclusion. Lord himself maintained for the rest of his life that the ship he had seen that night was not the Titanic, that there had been an unknown third vessel between his ship and the sinking liner. The question of how far away the Californian actually was, and whether her intervention could have saved lives, became one of the most discussed elements of the subsequent investigations. The answer depends on measurements that were made in darkness by tired men on moving ships, and on distances that nobody wrote down with sufficient precision, and the exact truth of it has remained at least somewhat open ever since. What is certain is that the rockets were seen. What is certain is that no one went to find out what they meant. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the forward section of the ship was low enough in the water that the ocean had begun to come aboard at the bow. The stern was rising. People on the boat deck could feel the tilt beneath their feet, a gentle but unmistakable inclination forward, the ship arranging itself according to the laws that governed what happened when a bow filled with water. The lifeboats that remained were being loaded and launched with more urgency than had been possible earlier, when the danger had seemed less immediate to those standing on the deck. Some boats went off more fully loaded. Some went off still not at capacity. The last few boats were launched in the final minutes of the ship's existence, in conditions that no longer permitted careful management. Collapsible Boat D was lowered with 44 people at approximately 2:05 a.m., one of the last boats to be sent away properly. The two remaining collapsible boats, canvas-sided vessels stored on the roof of the officers' quarters and designed to be floated free if a ship went down quickly, were worked at frantically by officers and crew in the final minutes. Collapsible B was washed off the roof and floated away upside down as the ocean reached the boat deck. It was later used as a platform by about 30 survivors who clung to it through the night. Collapsible A was barely freed before the water rose over it and floated off the deck with a small number of people aboard, partially flooded. At approximately 2:17 a.m., the forward funnel collapsed. The angle of the ship had become extreme enough by this point that what had been a floor was now effectively a slope, and moving across it required holding to whatever fixed objects remained available. The stern, as the bow went down, rose higher. The ship's lights, which had continued to burn through most of the sinking, went out around this time. In the darkness, and at that angle, the stresses on the hull reached the point at which the steel could no longer hold what was being asked of it. The ship broke. The break happened between the third and fourth funnels in a section of the hull that had been under enormous competing tensions as the bow descended and the stern was suspended in air. The bow portion separated and began its descent. The stern, freed from the weight that had been pulling it forward and down, swung back toward a more level position momentarily before the flooding in its own compartments, and the catastrophic damage to its structure sent it down in a different motion. The two halves reached the bottom of the North Atlantic separately, the bow traveling a largely intact path into the silt of the ocean floor, the stern rotating and collapsing in on itself as it fell, and coming to rest approximately a third of a mile away from the bow section. They lay on the floor of the Atlantic for 73 years before anyone found them. The total descent from the surface took approximately 15 minutes. The ocean at that location was about 12,500 feet deep. On the surface, the 705 people in the lifeboats experienced the end of the ship differently from one another. Those in boats nearest to the Titanic saw more. Those in boats that had been sent far out early in the evening saw only the lights going dark and a disturbance in the sky, and then a long quiet. In all of the boats, the temperature of the air was below freezing, somewhere around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which was also very close to the temperature of the ocean. The people in the water, more than 1,500 of them, would have had in water that cold perhaps 15 to 30 minutes before hypothermia made continued movement impossible, and less time than that before unconsciousness. The lifeboats returned to recover survivors after the ship had gone. Most boat commanders waited until the sounds in the water had diminished considerably before turning back, for reasons that in some cases reflected concern about being swamped by desperate people. Lifeboat 14, under the command of 5th Officer Harold Lowe, was among the few to go back into the field of wreckage and survivors while survivors could still be found. He rescued 4 people alive. At approximately 4:10 in the morning, the RMS Carpathia arrived. The Carpathia was a Cunard liner that had received the Titanic's distress call at approximately 12:20 a.m. and had immediately turned and driven through the night at maximum speed, her captain, Arthur Rostron, pushing the ship through ice fields in the dark at speeds her design had not intended, sending stokers below to do whatever was necessary to increase pressure in the boilers. She covered approximately 58 miles in 3 hours and 50 minutes. When she arrived, the Titanic had been on the floor of the ocean for approximately 2 hours. Rostron's crew brought the 705 survivors aboard through the dawn, and the Carpathia turned toward New York. The morning light of April 15, 1912, fell on the North Atlantic, as it always did, coming first across the sky to the east, then reaching the water, then illuminating the flat surface of the ocean and the fields of ice that had been moving through it in the dark. There were 16 lifeboats drifting on the surface, some still occupied by survivors who had not yet been reached, and a field of debris from the wreckage that stretched across a considerable area of water. The Californian, when she finally got underway in the morning and reached the scene, found this. Captain Lord, who had slept through most of the night, arrived at the position where the rockets had been fired and found an empty ocean and drifting wreckage and ice. The number of people who died in the sinking of the Titanic is recorded as 1,517, though estimates have varied slightly over the years as researchers have worked through the passenger and crew lists with greater precision. Of the 2,224 people aboard, roughly two-thirds died. The proportion was shaped by multiple overlapping factors: the shortage of lifeboat capacity, the time of night, and the temperature of the water, the distance to other ships, the speed with which the flooding progressed, and the structural conditions that meant the ship broke and sank faster than its designers had calculated. Any one of these factors altered on its own might have changed the total. All of them were present on the same night in the same sea. There had been, that Sunday, a kind of ordinary pleasantness to the day. Passengers had attended church services. The first-class dining saloon had served a lunch that ran to 11 courses. In the gymnasium, which occupied a portion of the boat deck, passengers had used the stationary bicycles and the rowing machines and the mechanical camel designed for equestrian exercise. The weather had been cold but clear and bright during the day, and the ocean had been calm enough to seem inviting. In the evening, a small orchestra had played in the first-class reception room. The stewards had made up the bunks. The wireless operators had been busy with the passenger messages they were required by commercial arrangement to send and receive. The personal notes and financial communications of the wealthy people who had paid a premium for the ability to send messages across the Atlantic from the middle of the ocean. The day had been, by most accounts, very pleasant. The evening had been pleasant too, until it wasn't. The Titanic had been at sea for 4 days and approximately 4 hours when the iceberg made contact with its hull. It had covered approximately 1,452 miles since leaving Southampton. It had never, in those 4 days, reduced speed significantly for ice. The officers who made the decision to maintain speed were not careless men. Several of them were experienced and regarded North Atlantic captains who had crossed the same ocean many times before. The practice of maintaining speed in ice conditions, relying on lookouts, and on the principle that large bergs could be seen and avoided before contact, was common enough in the era that it was not considered reckless by most of those who employed it. It had worked across many crossings many times before. On the night of April 14th, it did not work, and the reasons it did not work: the calm sea that removed the normal visual warning, the moonless sky, the absence of binoculars, the specific shape and coloring of that particular berg, were each individually unremarkable and together decisive. The last message the Titanic's wireless operators sent was received at approximately 2:17 a.m. by the Carpathia, which was still steaming toward the site. The message was not a formal transmission. It was simply a signal that dropped off in the middle, as though the sender had been interrupted. The Carpathia's operator listened for a reply to his acknowledgement and heard nothing. He listened for a while longer and then understood, from the quality of the silence, that there would be nothing more. The wireless tower had stood at the forward end of the ship, and the antenna stretched between it and the aft mast in a long wire that had carried signals in both directions through the 4 days of the crossing, the outgoing and the incoming, making their way through the Atlantic air in the particular way that wireless worked in 1912, bouncing from station to station across the surface of the ocean. After 2:17, the wire was no longer above the water. The tower was no longer above the water. The signals that had been passing through the air from that position for 4 days simply stopped, the way that any source of anything stops when it is no longer there. The North Atlantic continued as it had before the Titanic arrived in it, and as it has since. The ice that had been drifting south from the Greenland coast continued to drift. The shipping lanes continued to carry vessels across the wide water between Europe and North America. The water that had closed over the Titanic closed over it completely and returned to its ordinary surface. And the life that moved through those depths, the deep cold life of the mid-ocean, resumed whatever it was doing in the way that deep ocean life does, indifferent to the objects that settle onto its floor from the world above. On the morning of April 15th, with the sun still low, the Carpathia moved slowly through the ice field that had been the Titanic's passage, and then continued toward New York, carrying 705 people who had, some hours before, been passengers on a different ship. The lifeboats were brought aboard. The names of the survivors were recorded. The names of those not present were in that recording also established. Captain Rostron ordered the Carpathia's flags to half-mast. The ocean at 2:21 on the morning of April 15th, 1912, was quiet in the way that very large, very cold things are quiet. The stars that had been overhead all night were still overhead, their light reaching the surface of the water and going no further, absorbed by the dark. The voices that had been on the surface were scattered and growing fewer and more distant as the cold continued its work. The field of debris from the wreckage spread across a wide area of the Atlantic, moving with the water as debris moves, gradually separating over the hours. The place where the ship had been was not marked. There was no mark to leave. The ocean does not hold the shape of things that move through it, and a ship that has gone down leaves nothing on the surface that the surface does not also eventually take. What remained was the water and the ice moving slowly in it, and the stars reflected on the flat, cold, enormous dark, and the sound of voices that carried some distance across the still air of the North Atlantic at that hour, quiet and then quieter, and then, as the sky to the east began, very gradually, to change its color, the particular immense unhurried silence of a deep ocean in the hours before morning. A bookseller on Fulton Street in Lower Manhattan, sometime in the last week of April 1912, shook his head at a customer and said he had never stocked the book. He had barely heard of it. The title was Futility. The author was someone named Robertson, and the customer was the 4th or 5th person that week to come through the door asking for the same thing. The bookseller noted the name down. He would need to find a supplier. He had a feeling more customers would be coming. That small scene, a man behind a counter, a title written on a slip of paper, a book suddenly wanted by people who had not known it existed 2 weeks earlier, was repeating itself across New York and London and a dozen other cities where books were sold in the spring of 1912. The disaster had happened on the night of April 14th and into the morning of the 15th. By the time the newspapers had printed their first full accounts of what had occurred in the North Atlantic, someone had already noticed the coincidence. And once noticed, it moved quickly. The book had been published in 1898 by a small New York firm. It had sold modestly. It had gone out of print. For most of the 14 years between its publication and the sinking of the Titanic, it had been essentially unavailable, its author essentially unknown to anyone who had not specifically gone looking for maritime fiction. Morgan Robertson had written it as a working professional, writing about a subject he understood from the inside, and then he had moved on to other stories, other subjects, other cramped rooms, and other writing desks, and the novella had settled into the quiet oblivion that receives most books eventually. What the disaster did to that quiet oblivion was immediate and irreversible. The book that had existed in near silence for over a decade was, within days of the Titanic going down, the most discussed piece of fiction in the English-speaking world. The booksellers and librarians who found themselves turning customers away in late April 1912 were responding to something that had moved through the reading public with unusual speed, partly because newspapers had helped move it there. The press had not needed long to find the comparison. Within days of the sinking, editors at papers including the New York Times and the Daily Mail had assigned reporters to track down the details of Robertson's novella and place them alongside the known facts of the Titanic's construction and fate. The result was a form of journalism that the era had some practice at. The comparative table, the parallel column, the two sets of numbers, printed close enough together that readers could let their eyes move between them without losing the thread. The tables that appeared in those papers in late April and early May of 1912 were arresting to anyone who looked at them carefully. A fictional ship displacing approximately 45,000 tons appeared in one column. The real ship at 46,328 tons gross registered tonnage appeared in the other. 800 feet of fictional length appeared beside 882.5 feet of documented length. The fictional ship's three propellers, its high cruising speed, its April crossing, its iceberg collision on the starboard side, its dangerously inadequate number of lifeboats, each detail appeared in its column, and across from it in the other column, a corresponding detail from the documented record of the Titanic. The compositors setting the type for these tables had presumably paused over the numbers in the same way any reader would. The two columns aligned more closely than anyone who had not read the novella beforehand would have expected. Some of the newspapers were careful, some were not. The period was not one of especially rigorous fact-checking in popular journalism, and a few publications that ran the comparison either overstated the degree of correspondence or simply invented additional parallels that did not appear in Robertson's text. The more diligent accounts noted the real differences alongside the similarities. The fictional Titan was not the Titanic in every particular, and a reader who went to the novella expecting a blueprint for the real disaster would find a story that diverged from the historical record in significant ways. But the genuine correspondences were real and specific enough that accurate reporting alone produced the effect of astonishment. The newspapers that stuck to the documented facts did not need to exaggerate. The documented facts were, on their own, the kind of thing that made a reader stop and look again at the page. Robertson himself was not difficult to find in May of 1912. He was living in New York, as he had been for years, and reporters found him without much trouble. What they wanted from him was a particular kind of statement. They wanted the word prophecy, or they wanted something close to it, an acknowledgement that he had seen something known something, perceived something that ordinary writers did not perceive. What they got instead was a man who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with that framing, who deflected the mystical interpretation with what appears to have been real professional impatience, and who gave instead a technical account of how the novella had come to be written the way it was. Robertson described the trajectory of Atlantic liner construction as he had observed it from his years at sea and from his subsequent reading and professional attention to the industry. He had watched the ships getting larger through the 1880s and into the 1890s. He had understood the commercial logic that was driving them larger, the competition between lines, the premium that wealthy passengers placed on size and speed, the engineering advances that were making greater displacement possible without proportional increases in cost. He had understood, as any experienced mariner would, that size creates its own category of danger, that a very large ship moving at speed through iceberg-frequented waters carried a particular kind of vulnerability that smaller and slower vessels did not carry to the same degree. He had written those understandings into a story about a fictional ship, and the story had turned out to bear a close resemblance to a real one built 16 years later. What Robertson did not say, in any of the interviews that survive from that period, was that he had dreamed the ship into existence, or received its specifications from some source he could not account for, or felt any intuition that was separate from his professional knowledge. He seems to have found the mystical interpretation not only inaccurate, but somewhat irritating, in the way that a carpenter might find it irritating to have someone attribute a well-made joint to luck, rather than to the years of practice that had made it possible. His accurate details came from knowing what he was writing about. The ships of the era had been heading in the direction of the Titan for years before he put the Titan on paper, and anyone who had been paying professional attention to that trend could have sketched something similar. The newspapers that printed his restrained and technical explanations alongside the side-by-side comparison tables were perhaps not wrong to do both. The explanation and the correspondence were both true, and neither canceled the other. Robertson had used professional knowledge to build a plausible fictional ship. The plausible fictional ship had turned out to resemble a real one very closely. Both things could be held at once, and the second did not require the first to be set aside. The public appetite for the story did not much care, in those weeks, for the restrained explanation. The correspondence was the thing. The book was found and reprinted. Robertson's 14 years of obscurity ended in a period of sudden and somewhat uncomfortable public attention that he does not appear to have enjoyed very much. The reprinted edition of the novella, now retitled The Wreck of the Titan, sold well through the remainder of 1912 and into 1913. Robertson died in 1915 at a hotel in Atlantic City from an apparent overdose of paraldehyde, a sedative compound sometimes used for the treatment of alcoholism. He was 53. He did not leave a large estate. The book outlasted him by more than 100 years, which is more than most books manage, and more than Robertson himself could reasonably have expected when he first sent the manuscript to M.F. Mansfield's office on a New York street in the late 1890s. The case of Robertson and the Titan is the one that entered common knowledge and stayed there, but it was not the only case that the press and the public reached for in the weeks following the sinking. There was another name that circulated in those conversations, attached to a story that moved in a different direction from Robertson's and arrived at a different kind of coincidence. William Thomas Stead had been for several decades before 1912 one of the most prominent journalists in the English-speaking world. He had edited the Pall Mall Gazette in London and had made it one of the most widely read and widely argued about publications in the country. He was the kind of editor who believed that journalism could and should do things to the world, that a well-reported and forcefully presented piece of writing could change policy, alter institutions, bring the careless and the powerful to account. He had gone to prison for a story he published about child trafficking in London in 1885, a story that was later credited with contributing to changes in the law regarding the age of consent. He had spent his career accumulating the particular kind of reputation that comes from being correct about important things before other people are ready to agree. In 1886, Mended published a piece in the Pall Mall Gazette that was not a straight news story, but something closer to fiction with a journalistic purpose, a hypothetical account of a collision between two ocean liners in the Atlantic, in which hundreds of people drowned because there were not enough lifeboats aboard either vessel. The fictional account was detailed and specific in its rendering of what such a disaster might look like, and at the end of it, Stead appended an editorial note in his own voice, stepping out of the fiction to address the reader directly. The note pointed out that the scenario he had just described was not far-fetched, that the regulations then governing the number of lifeboats required on large passenger vessels were based on standards set decades earlier, when ships were much smaller and had not kept pace with the growth in vessel size. That a ship carrying 2,000 or 3,000 people was not legally required to carry lifeboats sufficient for all of them, that this was a fact and that it was worth attending to. The editorial note did not change the regulations. The regulations that governed the Titanic's lifeboat complement in 1912 were still based on the same outdated standards that Stead had identified as inadequate in 1886, 26 years earlier. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats which met the legal requirement of the time and which were sufficient for barely half the people aboard. Stead had described this precise failure, the gap between the people aboard and the boats available to carry them, in print, a generation before it became the central fact of the worst maritime disaster in the history of Atlantic passenger shipping. William Thomas Stead was aboard the Titanic on the night of April 14, 1912, traveling as a first-class passenger. He died in the sinking. He was 62 years old. Whether he was aware, as the night progressed and the lifeboats were loaded, that the number of boats being launched was the same inadequacy he had written about in 1886, is not known. There is no record of what he said or thought in those final hours. He is listed among the more than 1,500 people who did not reach a lifeboat in time, and the North Atlantic closed over him as it closed over all the others. The Stead case moved those who encountered it in the weeks after the disaster in a different direction from the Robertson case. Robertson had described a ship that resembled the Titanic before the Titanic was designed or built. Stead had described a failure, a systemic, regulatory, entirely preventable failure that the Titanic then demonstrated in practice and had then been present at that demonstration. The two cases sat together in the press coverage of May 1912 and have sat together in accounts of the disaster ever since, a pair of coincidences that pull the mind in slightly different directions without quite canceling each other out. What tied them together in the coverage of that period and in the thinking of anyone who has considered them since was the question of what imagination and professional knowledge applied carefully and honestly to observed conditions might produce. Robertson had not invented the problems that made his fictional disaster plausible. He had observed them in the ships he had served on, in the commercial logic of the industry, in the way that the incentives of speed and competition and passenger capacity were pushing vessels in a particular direction. Stead had not invented the regulatory failure he described. He had read the relevant statutes and compared them to the size of the ships then being built, and found the arithmetic troubling. Both men had applied attention to conditions that were genuinely present and genuinely concerning, and both had articulated the results of that attention in print, and in both cases the world had not acted on what they wrote, and in both cases the thing they described had then happened anyway. That quality, the quality of a warning accurately given and not acted upon, is perhaps more striking than the coincidence of the specific details. The lifeboats were the thing, not the tonnage figures, not the length, not the April crossing or the starboard collision. The lifeboats were the thing that mattered, and the inadequacy of the lifeboats was not a piece of mysterious foresight. It was a reading of existing conditions. It was the conclusion that any honest examination of the gap between the number of people these ships could carry and the number of boats required by law would reach. Robertson reached it for a fiction, Stead reached it for an editorial, and the Titanic demonstrated it in April 1912, as though both of them had drawn a diagram. The press in the spring and summer of 1912 was reaching for these stories because they provided a kind of frame for the disaster that was more bearable than pure contingency. If the sinking had been foreseen, if the thing had been written down, and the writing had somehow captured the shape of what was coming, then it was at least legible. It belonged to a pattern. It had meaning of a particular kind. The alternative, that 1,500 people died because a ship happened to be going fast on a night when an iceberg happened to be where the ship was going, was accurate but harder to hold. The Robertson comparison and the Stead story offered something closer to a narrative structure, and human attention, especially in the wake of great loss, reaches for narrative structure the way the eye reaches for light. Literary scholars who have looked carefully at the body of maritime fiction and journalistic speculation produced in the decades around the turn of the 20th century have found that Robertson and Stead were not outliers in their interest in the subject. The late 19th century produced a considerable body of writing, fiction, editorial, speculative journalism that imagined Atlantic liner disasters. Ships colliding, ships striking ice, ships going down in mid-ocean with insufficient means to save everyone aboard. The scenario was not Robertson's invention or Stead's invention. It was in the air. The ships were getting very large, the passenger numbers were very high, the regulatory framework was visibly outdated, and anyone who thought carefully about the combination could see at least the outline of the risk. Most of those other pieces of writing, the other fictional disasters, the other editorials about lifeboat regulations, the other imagined mid-Atlantic catastrophes, have been forgotten. They predicted things that did not happen, or they were less specific in their correspondence to the real event, or they simply had the bad fortune to be correct in a general way without being correct about the particular disaster that history chose to make famous. They exist in archives in the back issues of magazines that have mostly ceased publication, in the collections of libraries that have never been asked to digitize the relevant volumes. Nobody goes looking for them with the same urgency that booksellers felt when their customers came in asking for futility in late April 1912. They are the baseline, the ground from which the Robertson case stands out, and their existence is worth noting precisely because it recalibrates what the Robertson case means. Retrospective attention, moving back from a known disaster to find its antecedents, is very good at finding what it is looking for. A reader who knows that the Titanic sank in April after striking an iceberg on its starboard side after a maiden voyage during which it was described as unsinkable will find correspondences in Robertson's novella that a reader approaching the text without that knowledge would not necessarily notice, or would notice as one detail among many rather than as part of a pattern. The pattern becomes visible from the disaster backward. It is considerably less visible moving forward from 1898 toward a future that had not yet been determined. This is not to diminish the correspondence. The documented parallels between the Titan and the Titanic are real and specific and close enough that they remain worth attending to, even after the mechanism by which such correspondences arise is fully understood. What it is to say, instead, is that the Robertson case is most interesting not as evidence of something supernatural or inexplicable, but as evidence of how much information is contained in a careful, technically informed, professionally grounded look at the world. Robertson looked at the ships around him and at the direction the industry was heading, and he wrote down what that observation implied. What he wrote down turned out to be accurate in ways that went beyond the particular details. The culture of speed and scale and competitive luxury that he was describing, the systemic underpreparedness for disaster that he was dramatizing, the human tendency to believe that a thing that has never yet sunk will never sink, these were real conditions, and he wrote about them, and the real disaster when it came was shaped by exactly those conditions. The novella that sat out of print for 14 years and was then suddenly demanded in every bookshop in New York and London was not, in the end, a supernatural document. It was a piece of professional fiction written by a man who knew what he was writing about, and its uncanny quality comes not from anything outside the ordinary world, but from the depth and accuracy of its observation of that world. That kind of accuracy is, in its own way, more interesting than prophecy would be. Prophecy would require only the gift. Observation requires the years. Robertson's book found its way onto the shelves of libraries and private collections through 1912 and 1913 in its new edition. It was shelved, usually, in sections given over to maritime fiction or to historical documents related to the Titanic, a category that grew considerably in those years, as publishers recognized the appetite for material connected to the disaster. On those shelves it sat among other things, accounts of the sinking, written by survivors, technical analyses of what had gone wrong with the watertight compartment system, biographies of the passengers and crew, collections of newspaper articles from April and May of 1912, and on some shelves, other works of maritime fiction from the same era that bore no notable resemblance to any historical event, and whose authors had not found themselves called to newspaper offices to explain whether they believed in prophecy. The Robertson book and its neighbors on those shelves were, in one sense, simply books. They had pages and spines and cloth or paper covers. They had titles printed on them and authors' names, and in some cases publication dates, that now read as historical in the way that dates from before a catastrophe tend to read as historical. They held what had been written down, as books do, and they sat in the order in which they had been placed, as books do, and the rooms around them went about the ordinary life of rooms, dust accumulating slowly, light shifting through windows at the pace that light moves through windows, the temperature of the air rising and falling with the seasons in the quiet way the temperature rises and falls in rooms where books are kept. Among those books, the Robertson sat with its particular quality intact, not the quality of prophecy, not the quality of supernatural warning, the quality, instead, of professional attention accurately applied, a writer who had spent years at sea, who had understood from experience what the ships of his era were capable of and what they were not, who had brought that understanding to bear on a story about a very large ship going fast in cold water, and who had written that story down in 1898, and who had then lived in poverty and obscurity for 14 years, while the world built the ship he had described without reading what he had written about it. The two things, the book and the ship, had run alongside each other for all those years without touching. The book had been out of print, the ship had been under construction, then fitted out, then sailed from Southampton on an April morning with more than 2,000 people aboard, then struck an iceberg on a clear April night, then gone down. By the time the ship was gone, the book had been found again, and on those library shelves in 1913, with the reprinted edition standing among its contemporaries, the book continued in the particular way that books continue, holding its words in the order they had been set, available to whoever came looking for it, indifferent to being found or not found, unchanged by the 14 years of obscurity or by the sudden attention that had followed. The other maritime novels around it on those shelves continued too, in the quieter way of books that have not been called to attention by any particular coincidence of circumstance. They held their own imagined disasters, their own fictional ships and storms and collisions, their own invented versions of what might go wrong at sea. Most of them had not been vindicated by history in the way that Robertson's had, and most of them would not be. The disasters they imagined remained fictional. The ships they described had no doubles in any Belfast shipyard. Their authors had not been called to any newspaper office to decline the word prophecy. They occupied their portion of the shelf with the same quiet persistence as everything else on it. And if a reader came along and picked one of them up and opened it to a page somewhere in the middle, they would find a story about ships in the sea, written by someone who had thought about these things and put them down in a form that could be held and read and then placed back on the shelf, where it would wait for the next person who came looking. The shelf is a long one. It holds more than the disaster and more than its anticipations. It holds the whole long conversation that human beings have been having with the sea, in writing, the practical and the fearful and the wondering and the technical, the memoirs of sailors and the specifications of engineers, and the editorials of journalists, and the stories of writers who were all in their different ways trying to think clearly about what it meant to put very large ships into very deep water and trust the construction to hold. Robertson's book is one part of that conversation. Stead's editorial is another. The regulations that governed lifeboat numbers in 1912 represent, in their inadequacy, a third part, an answer given by institutions to a question the writers had already understood was open. The conversation has continued since 1912. The regulations changed after the disaster in the way that regulations often change after disasters have demonstrated their inadequacy. The ships kept getting built, larger and more elaborate, and the safety standards that governed them developed in response to what the Titanic had made impossible to ignore.